I'm Tessa, 34, and 3 days ago my husband collapsed at work and died of a sudden heart attack. At his funeral, his coworker whispered to me, "Check the supply closet on the third floor." Room 314, go alone, then disappeared into the crowd. I should have been planning memorial services, but instead I found myself sneaking into his office building at midnight with a key slipped into my purse. What I discovered in that closet shattered everything I thought I knew about the man I married, and revealed a truth that would destroy everyone who trusted him. The funeral program in my hands felt heavier now, not just because of grief, but because of what I'd started to notice. His volunteer work listed activities I'd never heard him mention. Colleagues I'd never met. A whole life I apparently knew nothing about. If you've ever wondered what secrets your loved ones might be hiding, like and subscribe because you won't want to miss what happens next. The office building stood silent at midnight, its glass facade reflecting the streetlights like a mirror hiding secrets. My hands trembled as I inserted the key into the employee entrance. The coworker I still didn't even know his name had pressed it into my palm during the funeral reception, his eyes wild with fear. The elevator ride to the third floor felt eternal. Each floor that passed brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted. Room 314 was tucked away at the end of a corridor lined with supply closets and storage rooms. Nothing special about it, just another beige door and an endless hallway of corporate monotony. Inside, shelves lined the walls filled with the usual office supplies: paper, toner cartridges, staplers, but something felt wrong. The room was too deep, too organized. My husband had worked in accounting, not facilities management. Why would anyone tell me to check a supply closet? I ran my hands along the back wall, feeling for anything unusual. That's when I found it, a panel that shifted. Under pressure. Behind it, a hidden compartment barely large enough for a shoebox, but filled with items that made my blood run cold. Stacks of cash, rubber-banded and organized by denomination, bank statements for accounts I'd never seen. And most damning of all, a leather-bound ledger with my husband's handwriting, documenting transactions that totaled over $2 million. Each entry was methodical, clinical. Client names I didn't recognize. Amounts transferred. Percentages taken. My husband hadn't just been embezzling, he'd been running a sophisticated operation, skimming money from client accounts and hiding it in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. The dates went back 3 years. 3 years of systematic theft while I'd been proud of his promotions, his bonuses, his success. 3 years of living a lie funded by stolen money. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor clutching the ledger. Every vacation we'd taken, every nice dinner, every piece of jewelry he'd surprised me with, all of it paid for with other people's money, other people's trust, other people's futures. But what terrified me most wasn't the theft itself. It was the final entry, dated just 2 days before his death. Final transfer complete. Closing all accounts. They're getting suspicious. Someone had discovered what he was doing. And now he was dead. The heart attack that had seemed so sudden, so random, suddenly felt deliberate, calculated. As I sat in that hidden compartment surrounded by evidence of crimes I never knew existed, I realized I wasn't just a widow. I was a target. Back home, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed threatening, every creak of the house made me jump. I found myself staring at our wedding photo on the nightstand, the one where we're cutting the cake, both of us beaming with what I'd always thought was pure joy. But now, looking at his smile, I saw something I'd missed before. A tightness around his eyes. A forced quality to his expression. Had he already been planning his crimes even then? Or was I reading deception into every memory now that I knew the truth? Our marriage had seemed perfect to everyone who knew us. 8 years of what I thought was partnership, honesty, complete trust. He handled all the finances because he was better with numbers, and I'd been grateful not to deal with the complexities of taxes and investments. I focused on my career in graphic design while he managed our future. "Don't worry about money, babe," he'd always say when I questioned a purchase. "Business is good. My bonus this quarter was bigger than expected." I'd believed every word because why wouldn't I? We were married. We were supposed to be a team, the luxury vacation to Italy. Last spring, I'd assumed it came from his legitimate success at the firm. The new car he'd surprised me with for my birthday, another reward for his hard work. The down payment on this house and the expensive neighborhood, proof of his financial acumen. All lies. All stolen. I remembered how he'd always insisted on doing our taxes alone, how he'd get irritated if I asked too many questions about our investments. "You don't need to worry about the details," he'd say. "Trust me to handle it." And I had trusted him completely and blindly. His business trips had become more frequent in recent months. Weekend conferences, client meetings, networking events. He'd come home exhausted, sometimes stressed, but I'd attributed it to the demands of his growing success. Now I wondered if those trips had anything to do with legitimate business at all. The late nights at the office. The password-protected laptop he never let me use. The second cell phone he claimed was just for work. All of it took on sinister, new meaning. How many other wives had sat in their comfortable homes, proud of their husbands' achievements, never knowing those achievements were built on other people's destroyed lives. I'd been so naive, so trusting. While I was designing logos and marketing materials for small businesses, believing in honest work and fair payment, my husband was systematically stealing from people who trusted him with their financial security. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing that I'd been complicit without knowing it. Every dollar I'd spent, every comfort I'd enjoyed, every time I bragged about his success to friends and family, I'd been participating in his crimes. Who was the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years? Who was the person I'd planned to grow old with, have children with, build a life with? Looking at that wedding photo now, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent hours digging through our financial records. What I found made my stomach turn. Our joint checking account showed regular deposits that were much larger than his stated salary. When I cross-referenced them with the dates in his hidden ledger, the pattern became clear. Every major theft corresponded with a deposit into our account, but it was the bank statements I found hidden in his home office that truly terrified me. Accounts I'd never heard of, opened in both our names, containing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Offshore transfers to places I couldn't even pronounce. Investment portfolios that showed returns no legitimate accountant could achieve. My name was on everything. Every fraudulent account, every illegal transfer, every piece of documentation that could send someone to prison. He'd made me an unwitting accomplice to his crimes, protecting himself by ensuring that if he went down, I'd go down with him. The paper trail painted a picture of systematic theft that had escalated over time. What started as small adjustments to client accounts had grown into a full-scale embezzlement operation. He'd been stealing retirement funds from elderly clients, college savings from young families, emergency funds from people who trusted him to protect their financial futures. One statement showed a transfer of $47,000 from an account belonging to someone named Margaret Chun, the same amount we'd used as a down payment for our house. Another showed $23,000 moved the week before he'd surprised me with that car. Every major purchase in our marriage had been funded by someone else's stolen dreams, but the most chilling discovery was a series of wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, each one larger than the last. The final transfer, completed just days before his death, moved over $400,000 offshore. It looked like he'd been planning to disappear, to start over somewhere far away from the consequences of his actions. Had he been planning to take me with him? Or was I just another loose end he'd planned to tie up before vanishing? The thought that the man I'd loved might have been planning to abandon me, or worse, made me physically sick. I found correspondence with lawyers specializing in international finance, travel documents for countries that didn't have extradition, treaties with the United States, and most disturbing of all, a life insurance policy on me that I'd never known existed. He'd insured my life for $2 million, with himself as the sole beneficiary. The man who'd kissed me goodbye every morning, who'd brought me coffee in bed on Sundays, who'd held me when I cried about my father's death, this same man had been planning something so sinister I could barely comprehend it. Every document I found raised more questions. How many people had he destroyed? How many families had lost everything because of his greed? And most terrifying of all, if someone had killed him to stop the stealing, what did they plan to do with me? As I sat surrounded by evidence of crimes I'd unknowingly funded, I realized that learning the truth was only the beginning. Now I had to figure out how to survive it. Finding the coworker who'd given me the warning took 3 days of calling the accounting firm and asking careful questions. His name was Kevin, and when I finally reached him, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We can't talk on the phone," he said immediately. "Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Street in an hour. Come alone and make sure you're not followed." The paranoia in his voice sent chills down my spine, but I needed answers. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Kevin was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall and his eyes constantly scanning the room. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I shouldn't be talking to you," he said as I sat down. "But I can't live with what I know." His phone buzzed on the table, and I could see text messages flooding in. The preview showed fragments. "You need to stay quiet, think about your family, and this doesn't concern you." Kevin noticed me reading and quickly flipped the phone over. "They've been messaging me since the funeral. Whoever killed your husband knows I was involved." "Involved in what exactly?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. "Everything's on here. Bank records, client files, correspondence with the people who were pressuring him. Your husband wasn't just stealing money, he was laundering it for some very dangerous people." According to Kevin, my husband had started small, skimming from client accounts to fund his own lifestyle. But when certain people noticed his skills, they'd approached him with a proposition. They had dirty money that needed to look clean, and he had access to legitimate client accounts and the expertise to move money without raising red flags. At first, he was just moving money through the system, Kevin explained, his voice shaking. But then he got greedy. He started keeping percentages for himself, larger and larger amounts. The people he was working for didn't appreciate being stolen from. The text messages on Kevin's phone were threats, warnings to keep quiet about what he knew. But Kevin had been my husband's assistant, and he'd seen everything. The late-night meetings, the encrypted communications, the growing fear in my husband's eyes as the pressure mounted. The last few weeks he was terrified, Kevin told me. He kept saying he'd made a mistake, that he needed to find a way out. He was planning to disappear, to take the money and run. But they found out about his plan. Kevin showed me printouts of communications between my husband and people with names, like the broker and Mr. Clean. The messages were coded, but the threat was clear. My husband had stolen from the wrong people, and they were demanding their money back with interest. "The heart attack wasn't natural," Kevin whispered, glancing around the coffee shop again. "They have people who can make things look medical, make problems disappear without leaving evidence. Your husband knew too much, and he'd become a liability." But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. Kevin pulled out another set of document surveillance photos of me going about my daily routine. Detailed information about my schedule, my work, my habits. "They've been watching you too," he said. "They think you know where the money is hidden. They think he told you about the offshore accounts before he died." As Kevin spoke, I realized the full scope of the danger I was in. My husband's death hadn't ended the criminal enterprise, it had just created a new problem that needed solving. And that problem was me. The flash drive Kevin gave me contained enough evidence to bring down a money laundering operation that stretched across multiple states and involved people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. But it also contained the proof that could either save my life or seal my fate. As I left the coffee shop, I knew I was walking into a nightmare where trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, and every decision could be my last. The insurance investigator arrived at my door 2 days later, a stern woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a briefcase full of questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Her name was Detective Morrison, and she specialized in suspicious death
claims.
"Mrs. Tessa," she said, settling into my living room with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "I need to ask you about some irregularities we've discovered regarding your husband's life insurance policy." My mouth went dry. I'd been so focused on the stolen money and the threats that I'd forgotten about the insurance payout. $5 million was an enormous sum, more than most people saw in a lifetime. Now it seemed like a motive for murder. Rather than a comfort for my grief, Detective Morrison pulled out a manila folder and spread documents across my coffee table. The life insurance policy my husband had taken out just 6 months before his death was there, along with medical records, financial statements, and what looked like surveillance photos. Your husband increased his life insurance from $500,000 to $5 million in February, she said, watching my reaction carefully. He also changed the beneficiary structure to ensure you'd receive the full amount immediately upon his death, with no waiting period or investigation required. The timing was suspicious, she explained. Most insurance companies required extensive medical examinations for such large policies, but my husband had somehow bypassed many of the standard requirements. He'd used his position at the accounting firm and his knowledge of financial systems to expedite the approval process. Did he mention any health concerns to you? Detective Morrison asked. Any reason he might have felt the need for such substantial coverage? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. My husband had been in excellent health, or so I'd thought. He exercised regularly, ate well, had no family history of heart disease. The sudden heart attack had shocked everyone, including his doctors, but Detective Morrison had done her homework. She'd spoken with the medical examiner, reviewed the autopsy results, and consulted with cardiologists about the unusual nature of his death. While the official cause was listed as myocardial infarction, there were irregularities that raised questions. Certain substances can cause heart attacks that mimic natural causes, she said carefully. Substances that might not show up in a standard autopsy unless someone knows to look for them specifically. She showed me toxicology reports that had been filed after the initial examination. Traces of digitalis, a heart medication that could be lethal in large doses, had been found in his system. But my husband had never been prescribed heart medication of any kind. Someone gave him a massive dose of digitalis, Detective Morrison explained. Enough to cause immediate cardiac arrest. It would have looked exactly like a natural heart attack to anyone not specifically testing for it. The insurance company had flagged the claim because of the policy timing, the large payout amount, and the suspicious circumstances of death. They were conducting their own investigation, separate from the police, because $5 million was worth protecting. I have to ask, Detective Morrison said, her eyes never leaving my face. Did you know about your husband's financial irregularities? The offshore accounts? The unexplained income? The business dealings we've uncovered? This was the moment I'd been dreading. I could lie, claim complete ignorance, and hope the investigation would leave me alone. Or I could tell the truth and risk becoming a suspect in my own husband's murder. I've recently discovered some things, I said carefully. Things that suggest my husband wasn't the man I thought he was. Detective Morrison nodded as if she'd expected this answer. We know about the embezzlement, Mrs. Tessa. We know about the money laundering, the offshore accounts, the people he was working with. What we don't know is whether you were involved, whether you knew what he was doing, and whether his death was connected to his criminal activities. She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. I'm going to be straight with you. You're in danger. The people your husband was stealing from don't make distinctions between willing participants and innocent victims. If they think you have access to their money, they'll come for you. The insurance investigation wasn't just about determining whether to pay the claim, it was about uncovering a criminal network that had already killed once and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. And I was caught in the middle, a widow who'd inherited not just money, but a target on her back. As Detective Morrison gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she handed me her card. If you remember anything, if anyone contacts you, if you feel threatened in any way, call me immediately. And Mrs. Tessa, don't try to handle this alone. These people are professionals. Watching her drive away, I realized the insurance money I'd been counting on for my future might never reach me. Worse, pursuing it might cost me my life. That night, I tore through my husband's home office like a woman possessed. Every drawer, every file, every hidden corner might contain clues about who had killed him and why. What I found in a hollowed-out law book made my blood freeze. The threatening letter was written on expensive paper in precise handwriting that suggested education and refinement. But the message was anything but civilized. You have 72 hours to return what you've taken, plus 50% interest for the inconvenience. Failure to comply will result in consequences that extend far beyond your own well-being. We know where she works. We know her schedule. We know she trusts you completely. The letter was dated 1 week before his death. Whoever had written it had been watching me, studying my routine, planning to use me as leverage against my husband. The she they referenced was clearly me, and the implied threat made my hands shake as I read. But there were more letters, a whole collection hidden behind false backs and filing drawers and taped under desk surfaces. Each one escalated the threats, each one more specific about the consequences of continued defiance. They knew our address, our cars, our vacation plans. They knew I had a sister in Portland and parents in Florida. They knew everything. The final letter, dated just 2 days before his death, was different. Shorter, more final. Since you've chosen not to cooperate, we'll be handling this matter directly. Thank you for making this necessary. It was a death sentence, delivered with the cold efficiency of a business memo. And now that my husband was dead, I was next on their list. I found evidence that my husband had tried to protect me. Bank transfers, moving money into accounts solely in my name, insurance policies with carefully worded beneficiary clauses, even a safe deposit box I'd never known about with keys hidden in his desk drawer. He'd been trying to ensure I'd be financially secure even if something happened to him, but he'd also been planning to run. Plane tickets to Costa Rica purchased but never used, cash hidden in places throughout the house, fake identification documents with our photos but different names. He'd been preparing for the possibility that we'd both need to disappear, to start over somewhere beyond the reach of the people he'd stolen from. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed dossier on me, compiled by professionals. They knew my work schedule down to the minute, my favorite coffee shop, my gym routine, even my therapist's appointment times. Photos showed me going about my daily life, completely unaware I was being watched and evaluated as a potential target. They'd been planning this for months, studying both of us, looking for weaknesses and pressure points. The dossier included psychological profiles, financial analysis, and what appeared to be contingency plans for different scenarios. They'd prepared for the possibility that my husband might resist, that he might try to run, that he might involve law enforcement, but they'd also prepared for me, plans for how to approach me after his death. Strategies for extracting information about hidden assets, detailed timelines for escalating pressure if I didn't cooperate. I wasn't just a grieving widow, I was a business problem that needed solving. Among the documents I found names and addresses of other people who'd crossed this organization. Some were marked with red X's and dates that I realized were death dates. Others had notes about family members who'd disappeared, businesses that had burned down, lives that had been systematically destroyed. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, control, and sending messages to anyone who might consider stealing from them in the future. My husband's death was meant to be an example, and my suffering was supposed to reinforce that example. But the most chilling discovery was a timeline that extended beyond my husband's death. They'd planned for a grace period, time to let me grieve, and lower my guard. Then would come the contact, the pressure, the gradual escalation until I either gave them what they wanted or joined my husband in death, according to their timeline. I had less than a week before they made their first move. Less than a week to figure out how to survive an enemy I couldn't see. Fighting a war I didn't understand, with weapons I didn't possess. As I sat surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had already claimed my husband's life, I realized that running wasn't an option. They'd find me anywhere I went. Hiding wasn't possible when they already knew everything about me. My only choice was to fight back. But first I had to figure out exactly who I was fighting. The partnership agreement I found buried in my husband's files revealed a business I'd never heard of, Meridian Financial Consulting. According to the documents, my husband had been a silent partner in what appeared to be a legitimate investment advisory firm. But the more I read, the clearer it became that Meridian was anything but legitimate. The company specialized in wealth management for high net worth individuals seeking privacy and discretion. In plain English, they laundered money for criminals who needed their ill-gotten gains to appear legitimate. My husband's role had been to provide the accounting expertise and access to client funds that made the operation possible. I decided to visit Meridian's offices, located in an upscale business district downtown. The reception area was all marble and mahogany, designed to project success and stability. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 30s, greeted me with practiced sympathy when I introduced myself as my husband's widow. "Oh, Mrs. Tessa, we're so sorry for your loss," she said, pressing a button under her desk that I pretended not to notice. "Mr. Harrison will want to meet with you immediately." Within minutes, a tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the elevator. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. And his handshake lingered just a moment too long as he expressed his condolences. "Your husband was invaluable to our operation," Harrison said as he led me to his corner office. His expertise in financial restructuring helped us serve some very demanding clients. "I'm sure you're here about his partnership share." The office was impressive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Art that probably cost more than most people's houses, furniture that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. But it was the photos on Harrison's desk that caught my attention, pictures of him with people I recognized from news reports about organized crime, politicians known for corruption, business leaders who'd been investigated for money laundering. "I'm still trying to understand exactly what my husband's role was here," I said carefully. "His accounts at home don't show any income from Meridian." Harrison's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Your husband preferred to keep his compensation in offshore accounts for tax purposes. Perfectly legal, of course, but it does complicate the transfer process now that he's deceased." He pulled out a file with my name on it, already prepared as if he'd been expecting this visit. Inside were documents that would transfer my husband's partnership share to me, along with access to accounts containing over $3 million. All I had to do was sign. "There is one small matter," Harrison continued, his tone remaining conversational. "Some of our clients had developed personal relationships with your husband. They're concerned about the continuity of certain services he provided. Specialized accounting work that required his particular expertise." The specialized work, he explained, involved moving money through complex international transfers that obscured its origins. My husband had developed systems for converting criminal proceeds into legitimate-looking investments, and his clients were anxious to ensure those systems remained operational. "I'm not an accountant," I said, though I was beginning to understand the real reason for this meeting. "Of course not," Harrison agreed. "But you do have access to your husband's files, his client lists, his methods. Our clients would be very grateful if you could help facilitate a smooth transition of his responsibilities." The subtext was clear. They wanted me to continue my husband's criminal work, to become an active participant in the money laundering operation. And if I refused, I would become a problem that needed solving. Harrison showed me photographs of the life I could have: luxury homes, exotic vacations, financial security beyond anything I'd ever imagined. He also showed me, more subtly, photographs of people who'd chosen not to cooperate, newspaper clippings about mysterious accidents, obituaries of former business associates, police reports that would never be solved. "Your husband's death was tragic," Harrison said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to make his meaning clear. "Heart attacks are so unpredictable. But for someone young and healthy like yourself, with proper precautions, there's no reason to expect similar health problems." As I sat in that luxurious office, surrounded by the trappings of criminal success, I realized I was being recruited into the same organization that had killed my husband. They were offering me his blood money and his position in their enterprise, as if his murder was simply a job opening that needed filling. The partnership agreement wasn't just a business document. It was a contract for my soul. Sign it, and I'd become complicit in crimes that destroyed lives and funded even worse activities. Refuse, and I'd join my husband in death. Another cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could cross these people and survive. Harrison walked me to the elevator, his hand resting possessively on my shoulder. "Take your time to consider our offer," he said. "But don't take too much time. Our clients are eager to resume normal operations, and delays make them nervous." And nervous clients sometimes make poor decisions. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, I understood that this meeting had been a test. They were evaluating whether I could be useful to them or whether I needed to be eliminated as a potential threat, based on the cold calculation in Harrison's eyes. I suspected I'd already failed that test. I knew I had to tell my in-laws about their son's death and his crimes, but I dreaded the conversation. They'd always been proud of him, bragging to their friends about their successful son and his beautiful wife. How do you destroy parents' memories of their child while asking for their help to survive? When I arrived at their modest home in the suburbs, I found them going through financial documents at their kitchen table, looking confused and worried. My mother-in-law, usually so put together, looked exhausted. My father-in-law, normally robust, despite his 72 years, seemed to have aged a decade in the weeks since the funeral. "Tessa, thank goodness you're here," my mother-in-law said, embracing me with trembling arms. "We're having trouble with the bank. They're saying there are problems with our accounts, things we don't understand." The family trust documents I'd found among my husband's papers suddenly made horrifying sense. As I suspected, my husband hadn't limited his theft to clients and criminal associates he'd stolen from his own parents. "What kind of problems?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My father-in-law pulled out bank statements showing their retirement accounts, which should have contained nearly $400,000, had been systematically drained over the past 2 years. Their savings, their emergency fund, even the money they'd set aside for their grandchildren's education, all of it was gone. "The bank says someone with power of attorney has been making transfers," he said, his voice breaking. "But we never gave anyone power of attorney except—" He stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Except your son," I finished for him, my heart breaking as I watched their world collapse. The documents showed that my husband had convinced his parents to give him financial power of attorney 2 years ago, supposedly to help them manage their investments more efficiently. Instead, he'd used that access to steal their life savings, transferring their money into the same offshore accounts he'd used for his other crimes, but the betrayal went deeper than simple theft. I found correspondence between my husband and a financial advisor who'd been pressuring his parents to sell their house and move into a retirement community. The advisor was on Meridian's payroll, and the plan was to use the proceeds from the house sale to cover some of my husband's debts. To his criminal associates, his own parents had been nothing more than assets to liquidate when he needed money to save his own life. "We trusted him completely," my mother-in-law whispered, staring at the evidence of their son's betrayal. "When he said he could get us better returns on our retirement money, we believed him. When he said the transfers were for tax purposes, we signed whatever he put in front of us." They'd been living on Social Security for months, too proud to ask for help, too confused by the financial complexity to understand what had been done to them. They'd been struggling to pay for medications, skipping meals to afford utilities, all while believing their money was safely invested and growing under their son's expert management. The family trust that should have protected their assets had been restructured to give my husband complete control. He'd changed beneficiaries, altered distribution terms, and created legal mechanisms that made it nearly impossible for his parents to access their own money without his permission. "There's more," I said gently, knowing I had to tell them everything. "Your son was involved in criminal activities. Money laundering, embezzlement, working with dangerous people. His death wasn't natural. He was murdered because he stole from the wrong people." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as decades of pride and love and trust crumbled in their eyes, replaced by confusion, anger, and devastating grief. They weren't just mourning their son's death, they were mourning the discovery that the son they'd loved had never really existed. But as we talked through the night, sharing tears and trying to make sense of the betrayal, I realized that some family members had suspected something was wrong. My husband's brother had questioned the frequent requests for loans that were never repaid. His sister had wondered about the expensive gifts he gave despite claiming to be helping support his parents financially. "We wanted to believe in him," his father said finally. "When your child tells you they're successful, that they're taking care of everything, you want to believe it's true." The family trust documents revealed that I wasn't the only one in danger. My husband had listed his parents and siblings as references for various financial transactions, creating paper trails that connected them to his criminal activities. If his associates decided to pressure the family for information or payment, his elderly parents would be defenseless. As dawn broke over the kitchen table where we'd spent the night piecing together the truth, I realized that my husband's crimes had created victims in every corner of his life. His clients, his criminal associates, his family, and me, all of us had trusted him. And all of us had paid the price for that trust, but we were still alive, which meant we still had choices to make. The question was whether we could find the courage to make the right ones, even when the right choice might be the most dangerous one. Looking at his parents, already victimized and vulnerable, I knew I couldn't let them suffer for their sons' crimes. Whatever happened next, I had to find a way to protect the people he'd left behind while seeking justice for the people he'd destroyed. Detective Rodriguez arrived at my door the next morning with coffee and the kind of tired expression that comes from working too many cases with too few answers. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a directness I found both comforting and terrifying. "Mrs. Tessa, I'm investigating your husband's death," she said, settling into my living room with the same careful attention to surroundings that Detective Morrison had shown. "I know you've already spoken with the insurance investigator, but I have some additional questions about the circumstances." She pulled out a manila folder that was considerably thicker than the one Detective Morrison had carried. The police report inside listed my husband's death as suspicious circumstances pending investigation, which sent a chill down my spine. The official narrative was changing from natural causes to potential homicide. "We've discovered some irregularities that suggest your husband's death may not have been natural," Detective Rodriguez said, watching my reaction carefully. "The toxicology reports show levels of digitalis that couldn't have occurred naturally or accidentally." She showed me photographs from the crime scene that I hadn't seen before: my husband's office, his desk, his car. In each photo, red circles highlighted details that suggested someone had been there after his death, rearranging things, removing evidence, cleaning up traces of their presence. "Someone wanted his death to look natural," she explained. "They were careful, professional, but not perfect. We found fingerprints that don't belong to your husband or any of his known associates. We found traces of substances that shouldn't have been in his office. Most importantly, we found this." She handed me a photograph of a small device that looked like a pen but was actually a digital recorder. It had been hidden under my husband's desk, probably placed there to monitor his conversations and activities in the days before his death. "Whoever killed your husband was tracking his movements, recording his conversations, gathering intelligence before they made their move," Detective Rodriguez said. "This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, it was a carefully planned execution." The police report contained details that painted a picture of my husband's final days that I hadn't known. He'd been receiving threatening phone calls at work, had asked building security to escort him to his car, had even inquired about hiring personal protection. He'd known he was in danger, but he'd hidden that fear from me completely. "Did your husband seem different in the weeks before his death?" Detective Rodriguez asked. "More stressed, more secretive, more concerned about security?" I thought back to those final weeks, remembering details I'd dismissed at the time. He had been more anxious, checking locks multiple times before bed, insisting I take different routes to work, encouraging me to vary my schedule. I'd attributed it to work stress, but now I realized he'd been trying to protect me without explaining why protection was necessary. "We know about the money laundering operation," Detective Rodriguez said, her tone becoming more serious. "We know about Meridian Financial, the offshore accounts, the criminal associates. What we don't know is how much you knew about your husband's activities and whether you're in danger now." This was the moment I'd been dreading. The moment when I had to decide whether to trust law enforcement or continue trying to handle this situation alone. Detective Rodriguez seemed genuine, but I'd learned that appearances could be deceiving. How did I know she wasn't connected to the same organization that had killed my husband? "I've discovered some things," I said carefully, testing her reaction. Things that suggest my husband wasn't the man I thought he was. Detective Rodriguez nodded, pulling out a digital recorder and placing it on the table between us. Mrs. Tessa, I'm going to be direct with you. You're in extreme danger. The people who killed your husband are professionals who eliminate threats to their operation. If they believe you have information that could hurt them, they won't hesitate to kill you too. She explained that the police had been investigating Meridian Financial for months as part of a larger organized crime task force. My husband's murder had accelerated their timeline, but they still needed more evidence to make arrests that would stick. More importantly, they needed someone on the inside who could help them understand the full scope of the operation. We can offer you protection, Detective Rodriguez said, but we need your cooperation. We need access to your husband's files, his contacts, his methods. We need you to help us understand how the money moved and where it's hidden. The offer was tempting police. Protection, legal immunity, the possibility of justice for my husband's murder. But it also meant becoming a target for every criminal in the organization, putting my life on the line to help convict people who killed without hesitation. What happens if I say no? I asked. Detective Rodriguez's expression grew grim. Then, you try to survive on your own against people who have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. And statistically speaking, people in your situation don't survive very long. She left her card and the police report, along with a phone number for witness protection services. You don't have to decide right now, she said, but don't wait too long. Every day you delay is another day they have to plan your elimination. As I watched her drive away, I realized that my options had narrowed to two equally terrifying choices: trust the police and become a target, or try to disappear and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. But there was a third option that Detective Rodriguez hadn't mentioned, one that was dangerous but might be the only way to end this nightmare permanently. Instead of running from my husband's killers or hiding behind police protection, I could hunt them down and destroy them before they destroyed me. The question was whether I had the courage to become the kind of person who could win a war against professional criminals, and whether I could do it without losing my soul in the process. Hidden in the back of my husband's closet, inside a shoebox that supposedly contained old running shoes, I found a burner phone that changed everything I thought. I knew about the scope of his criminal activities. The phone contained hundreds of messages spanning the past year, conversations with people identified only by code names: The Cleaner, Baltimore, Phoenix, Ice Queen. The messages revealed a network of criminals that extended far beyond the money laundering operation I discovered at Meridian Financial. My husband hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been the financial coordinator for a criminal enterprise that included drug trafficking, weapons sales, human trafficking, and murder for hire. The phone contained payment schedules for assassinations, logistics for moving contraband across state lines, and accounting records for operations that generated millions in illegal revenue. One conversation thread made my blood run cold. Was between my husband and someone called the surgeon, discussing the best methods for eliminating targets without leaving forensic evidence. They'd tested various substances and techniques, including the digitalis that had ultimately killed my husband, on other victims whose deaths had been ruled natural causes. The wife might be a problem, my husband had written just 2 weeks before his death. She's smarter than she appears, and she's starting to ask questions about the money. Problems have solutions, the surgeon had replied. When you're ready to implement a permanent solution, let me know. I can make it look like a tragic accident. They've been planning to kill me. My own husband had been discussing my murder as if it were a business decision, weighing the risks and benefits of eliminating his wife to protect his criminal operation. The man who'd held me while I slept had been planning to ensure I never woke up, but as I read further, I discovered that my husband had ultimately refused to authorize my death. His final messages showed growing paranoia and regret, desperate attempts to find a way out of the organization without triggering retaliation against me or his family. I want out, he'd written to someone identified as the boss. I'll return the money, all of it, plus interest. Just let me disappear with my wife. We'll go somewhere far away and never cause problems. You know too much to retire, came the reply. And your wife knows enough to be dangerous even if she doesn't realize it yet. There's only one way out of this organization. And you know what? That is, the final series of messages revealed the timeline of my husband's murder. The surgeon had been contracted to eliminate him using methods that would appear natural. And contingency plans were already in place to deal with me if I became problematic after his death. But the most terrifying discovery was in the phones. Contact list over 200 criminal associates spread across the country, each one identified by location and specialty. There were people who specialized in eliminating evidence, others who arranged untraceable murders, financial experts who moved money through impossible-to-track channels. This wasn't just a regional operation. It was a national criminal network with resources that dwarfed anything I'd imagined. They had contacts in law enforcement, connections in the financial industry, and the ability to make people disappear without leaving traces. Among the contacts was a name that made my stomach drop. Rodriguez. Insurance. Detective Rodriguez, who'd promised to protect me and asked for my cooperation, was listed in my husband's criminal contact list. Either she was undercover so deep that even my husband didn't know her true identity, or she was working for the same people who'd killed him. The phone also contained surveillance schedules, detailed records of when I was watched, where I went, who I spoke to. They'd been monitoring me for months, documenting my routines and relationships, preparing for the possibility that I might need to be eliminated. Recent messages showed that decision had already been made. The wife is becoming active, read a message from yesterday. She's asking questions, meeting with investigators, accessing files she shouldn't have. Recommend immediate action before she compromises the operation. According to the timeline, in the messages, I had less than 24 hours before they moved against me. They'd already positioned assets in my neighborhood, identified the best locations for an ambush, and selected methods that would make my death appear accidental. As I sat in my closet reading evidence of my impending murder on my dead husband's secret phone, I realized that every choice I'd made since finding the supply closet had been anticipated and planned for. They'd been steering me toward this moment, allowing me to discover just enough truth to make me dangerous while ensuring I'd be easy to eliminate when the time came, but they'd made one crucial mistake. By letting me find the phone, they'd given me access to their network, their methods, and their plans. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew as much about them as they knew about me. The question was whether I could use that knowledge to survive the next 24 hours and turn the tables on people who'd made murder their profession. I was about to find out if a grieving widow could outwit killers who'd never failed to eliminate their targets. The game had changed. And for the first time, I might actually have a chance to win. Using the client files I'd found in my husband's hidden records, I began reaching out to the people whose lives he'd destroyed. I needed to understand the full scope of his crimes, but more importantly, I needed to find allies, people who wanted justice as badly as I did and might be willing to help me get it. The first person I contacted was Margaret Chun, the elderly woman whose retirement savings had funded our house down payment. When I called and explained who I was, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. "Your husband destroyed my life," she finally said, her voice shaking with controlled rage. 40 years of saving, of sacrificing, of trusting someone who promised to help me secure my future. All gone in 6 months of creative accounting. Margaret agreed to meet me at a diner near her apartment, which I discovered was in a part of town where people went when they'd lost everything else. She was 73 years old, working part-time at a grocery store to afford rent and medication. Living in a studio apartment after losing the home she'd owned for 30 years. He was so charming, she told me over coffee she couldn't really afford. So professional, so knowledgeable about investments. He showed me how my money could work harder, generate better returns, fund a comfortable retirement. I trusted him completely. The client file I'd found showed that my husband had convinced Margaret to liquidate her conservative investments and move everything into high-risk accounts that he controlled. Then he'd systematically stolen her money while sending her fake statements showing fictional gains. I didn't realize what had happened until I tried to withdraw money for my husband's cancer treatment. Margaret continued. That's when I learned the accounts were empty. that the investments had never existed, that the man I'd trusted had stolen everything. Her husband had died 6 months later, unable to afford the experimental treatments that might have saved his life. Margaret blamed herself for trusting my husband, for being naive enough to believe promises that were too good to be true. But Margaret's story was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I met with a dozen victims whose lives my husband had shattered. There was James, a young father who'd lost his daughter's college fund and now worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. There was Patricia, a nurse who'd invested her pension money and was now facing retirement with nothing but Social Security. Each story was heartbreaking. But it was David's story that nearly broke me completely. He was only 26 and my husband had stolen the money his parents had saved for his wedding, his first house, his future. When the theft was discovered, the stress had triggered his father's fatal heart attack. "Your husband didn't just steal money," David told me, his eyes filled with grief and rage. "He stole hope, security, trust. He destroyed families and didn't care as long as he got what he wanted." The victim files revealed the calculated cruelty of my husband's methods. He targeted vulnerable people, elderly retirees, young families, recent immigrants who trusted authority figures. He'd studied their psychology, exploited their fears and dreams, and manipulated them into giving him access to their life savings. But as I listened to their stories, I also discovered something unexpected. Several of his victims had banded together, sharing information and supporting each other through the aftermath of their financial destruction. They'd formed an informal network, documenting his methods and trying to help law enforcement build a case against him. "We've been investigating your husband for 2 years, Patricia told me during our meeting. "We knew about the offshore accounts, the fake investments, the money laundering. We even suspected he was working with organized crime, but we could never prove it. They showed me evidence they'd gathered, recorded phone calls, documented lies, financial records that proved the scope of his theft. They'd been building a case that could have sent my husband to prison for the rest of his life, if he'd lived long enough to face trial. The problem is that most of the evidence died with him," James explained. "The accounts are closed, the money's disappeared, and without his testimony it's hard to prove what he did to us." But they still wanted justice. Not just for themselves but for other potential victims. They'd learned that my husband's methods were being copied by other criminals, that his techniques for stealing retirement money and hiding assets were spreading through the financial fraud community. "We heard about your situation," Margaret sighed quietly. "We know you're in danger from the same people who killed your husband. If there's anything we can do to help you survive this and get justice for all of us, we want to help." As I sat with these people whose lives my husband had destroyed, I realized that I wasn't alone in this fight. Yes, I was the primary target of his criminal associates, but I was also connected to a community of victims who understood the stakes better than anyone. They couldn't protect me from professional killers, but they could provide something equally valuable: evidence, testimony, and the moral authority that comes from representing innocent people who'd been victimized by the same criminals who now wanted me dead. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was part of something larger than my own survival. I was part of a quest for justice that went beyond my husband's murder to encompass all the lives he'd destroyed and all the crimes that needed to be answered for. The question was whether we could work together to achieve that justice before his associates eliminated the only witness who could connect all the pieces of their criminal enterprise. The recording device I'd purchased was smaller than a button and nearly invisible when properly positioned. If I was going to expose the people who killed my husband, I needed evidence that would stand up in court: confessions, admissions, proof of their criminal activities that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Working with the victim network I discovered, we developed a plan that was dangerous but necessary. Using the burner phone I'd found, I would contact my husband's associates and arrange meetings under the pretense of negotiating my cooperation with their operation. Each meeting would be recorded, and the evidence would be immediately uploaded to secure servers that the victims had established. Detective Rodriguez had left multiple messages asking for another meeting, but I couldn't trust her until I knew whether she was legitimate law enforcement or part of the criminal organization. The recording device would help me determine which side she was really on. I started with Harrison from Meridian Financial. sending a message through official channels, requesting a follow-up meeting about my husband's partnership share. If he was as confident as he'd seemed during our first encounter, he might reveal more details about the organization's structure and methods. "Mrs. Tessa," Harrison said when I arrived at his office the next morning, "I'm pleased you've decided to consider our offer. I trust you've had time to review the advantages of continuing your husband's work with our organization." I positioned myself carefully so the recording device would capture our entire conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding my husband's specialized services. I want to understand exactly what would be expected of me." Harrison's confidence was evident as he explained the money laundering operation in detail, apparently convinced that I was ready to become a willing participant. He described how dirty money moved through legitimate accounts, how client funds were diverted and mixed with criminal proceeds, how profits were shared among the organization's members. "Your husband was particularly gifted at creating paper trails that looked completely legitimate," Harrison said. "Tax documents, investment records, legal transfers, everything appeared proper to outside observers while serving our clients' needs for financial privacy. But it was when I asked about my husband's death that Harrison revealed information that would prove crucial in court. His unfortunate health problems came at a difficult time," he said carefully. "Some of our clients had become concerned about his commitment to discretion. His death resolved those concerns, though it did create the complication of your situation." The recording captured Harrison admitting knowledge of concerns about my husband's loyalty, suggesting foreknowledge of his death, and implying that his murder had solved organizational problems. More importantly, he detailed the criminal network's structure, naming other participants and describing their roles in various illegal activities. My next target was the surgeon, the person who'd actually carried out my husband's murder. Using the burner phone, I sent a message indicating that I had information about my husband's hidden assets and was willing to trade that information for my safety. The meeting location he specified was a parking garage downtown, isolated enough for privacy but public enough that I felt relatively safe. The surgeon turned out to be a professional-looking man in his 40s who could have been anyone's accountant or insurance agent. "You have something that belongs to my employers," he said without preamble. "Your husband stole money that needs to be returned, and you're going to help us recover it." I pretended to negotiate, asking questions about exactly how much money was involved and what would happen to me after I provided the information they wanted. The surgeon's responses revealed details about the murder method, the organization's decision-making process, and plans for eliminating witnesses. "Your husband made the mistake of thinking he could steal from people who kill thieves," the surgeon said. "The digitalis was quick and relatively painless, more mercy than he deserved. Your death will be similarly efficient if you choose not to cooperate." But the most valuable recording came from an unexpected source. Kevin, the coworker who'd warned me about the supply closet, contacted me with information about another meeting. Harrison and other organization leaders were gathering to discuss how to handle the widow problem, and Kevin had been invited to participate because of his knowledge of my husband's activities. Kevin agreed to wear a recording device to that meeting, understanding that his life was also in danger if the organization decided he knew too much. The recording he obtained revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise and their plans for eliminating anyone who could threaten their operation. "The wife has been more active than we anticipated," Harrison's voice said on the recording. "She's contacted victims, spoken with law enforcement, and accessed files that could compromise multiple aspects of our operation. The decision has been made to eliminate her before she can cause further damage." The recording captured detailed discussions of murder methods, disposal techniques, and contingency plans for handling law enforcement investigation. More importantly, it identified the organization's leadership structure, their various criminal activities, and their connections to legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal operations. As I compiled the evidence from multiple recordings, I realized I had enough material to destroy the entire criminal network. The recordings contained confessions to murder, detailed descriptions of money laundering operations, and admissions of crimes that would result in life sentences for everyone involved. but possessing the evidence and surviving long enough to present it in court were two different challenges. The organization had already decided to kill me, and they had the resources and expertise to carry out that decision efficiently. The recordings had given me the weapons I needed to fight back. But now I had to figure out how to use those weapons without getting killed in the process. The trap had been set, and the evidence gathered now came the most dangerous part of the plan. I had to stay alive long enough to spring the trap and ensure that justice was finally served for my husband's murder and all the other crimes this organization had committed. The question was whether I could outmaneuver professional killers who were already closing in on me. The signed confession I obtained would be the final piece of evidence needed to bring down the entire organization. But getting it required putting myself in extreme danger. The surgeon had agreed to meet me at an abandoned warehouse where we could discuss terms for my cooperation, though I knew he was planning to kill me there. I wore the recording device and carried backup equipment hidden throughout my clothing. The victim network knew my location and had instructions to contact law enforcement if I didn't check in within 2 hours. It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was better than facing a professional killer completely alone. The warehouse was exactly what I'd expected: isolated, dark, and filled with places to hide evidence of violence. The surgeon was already there when I arrived, along with 2 other men who looked like they specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "You've caused us considerable inconvenience," the surgeon said as I approached. "Your husband's theft was manageable, but your investigation threatens our entire operation. That's unacceptable." I pretended to be terrified and cooperative, explaining that I just wanted to survive and was willing to give them everything they wanted. "I have access to all of my husband's files," I said. "Bank account numbers, passwords, client lists, everything you need to recover the stolen money." But the surgeon wasn't interested in recovering money. He was there to eliminate a threat. "Your husband stole $2.3 million from our organization," he said. "But the real problem isn't the money. It's what you know about our methods, our associates, our operations." As he spoke, the surgeon revealed details about the murder that only the killer could know. He described exactly how he'd administered the digitalis, how he'd made my husband's death appear natural, how he'd cleaned up evidence that could connect him to the crime. "I've killed 17 people using similar methods," he said with professional pride. "Heart attacks, strokes, accidents that leave no forensic evidence. Your husband was textbook. He never even knew what was happening until it was too late." I encouraged him to continue talking, asking questions about his techniques and methods while the recording device captured every word. He detailed other murders he'd committed for the organization, described methods for disposing of bodies, and explained how they'd avoided detection for years. But it was when he started describing my planned death that I got the confession that would seal his fate in court. "You'll have a tragic accident," he said, moving closer. "A fall, perhaps, or maybe carbon monoxide poisoning in your garage. Something that will look completely natural and won't raise questions."
He pulled out a syringe filled with a clear liquid.
"Actually, I think we'll go with the same method I used on your husband. Digitalis overdose, quick and efficient. By the time anyone finds you, it will look like grief-induced heart failure." As the surgeon approached with the syringe, I activated a panic button that would alert law enforcement to my location. But help was minutes away, and I needed to survive the next few crucial moments. "Wait," I said, backing toward the warehouse exit. I recorded everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every confession. If I die, those recordings go to the FBI automatically. The surgeon paused, calculating whether I was bluffing. "You're lying," he said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Harrison confessed to money laundering, I continued, edging toward the door. "Kevin recorded your planning meeting. I have evidence of 17 murders, detailed financial records, and confessions from multiple organization members. Kill me, and all of that evidence gets released immediately." The other men looked to the surgeon for guidance, unsure whether to proceed with the murder or retreat. In that moment of hesitation, I heard the sound I'd been praying for: sirens. In the distance, growing louder as police units responded to my panic signal. "She's telling the truth," one of the men said, having spotted police cars approaching the warehouse. We need to leave now. But the surgeon was too committed to his mission. Dead witnesses can't testify, he said, lunging toward me with the syringe. I ran for the exit as he pursued me, shouting into my recording device to document what was happening in case I didn't survive. The surgeon is attempting to murder me. With digitalis injection, I said. Same method used to kill my husband. This is happening at the Bradford Street warehouse. Police tactical units surrounded the building just as the surgeon caught up to me near the entrance. Faced with immediate arrest, he made a crucial mistake. He tried to negotiate, admitting to crimes in exchange for consideration from law enforcement. I can give you the entire organization, he told the officers as they handcuffed him. Names, methods, financial records, everything, but I want immunity for my cooperation. The recording device captured his offer to testify against his criminal associates, his admission of involvement in multiple murders, and his detailed knowledge of the organization's structure and operations. Most importantly, it documented his attempt to kill me using the same method that had murdered my husband. As I watched the surgeon being led away in handcuffs, I realized that the most dangerous part of my plan had succeeded. I'd obtained the evidence needed to prosecute him for my husband's murder and dozens of other crimes. More importantly, I'd survived long enough to ensure that evidence would reach law enforcement. But the confrontation had revealed something crucial. The organization was larger and more dangerous than I'd realized. The surgeon was just one operative in a network that included dozens of criminals who would now be focused on eliminating me before I could testify against them. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the war was far from over. I'd won a crucial battle by obtaining confessions and surviving an assassination attempt, but the organization would undoubtedly retaliate for the arrest of one of their key operatives. The question was whether law enforcement could move fast enough to arrest the other organization members before they could silence me permanently. I'd gathered the evidence needed for justice, but I still had to survive long enough to see that justice served. The court subpoena arrived 3 months later, officially calling me to testify against the criminal organization that had murdered my husband and destroyed countless lives. By then, the recordings I'd obtained had triggered a massive federal investigation that resulted in dozens of arrests and the dismantling of a criminal network that had operated for over a decade. The federal courthouse was a fortress of security. As I arrived to give my testimony, U.S. Marshals escorted me through back entrances and secure corridors, constant reminders that even with most of the organization in custody, threats against my life remained credible and immediate. Detective Rodriguez, who turned out to be genuinely undercover FBI rather than corrupt law enforcement, briefed me on what to expect during testimony. Your recordings are the foundation of our entire case, she explained. Without your evidence, most of these people would have walked free. The prosecution had built an impressive case using the materials I'd gathered. The surgeon had been charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder, including my husband's death. Harrison faced money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering charges that would put him in prison for life. Kevin, in exchange for his cooperation and the recordings he'd made, received immunity and witness protection. But it was during my testimony that the full scope of the organization's crimes became clear to the jury. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, walking through evidence that connected seemingly unrelated crimes across multiple states and involving dozens of victims. The defendant Harrison admitted to me that my husband's death resolved concerns about his commitment to discretion. I testified, playing the recording that captured his confession. He described the murder as solving organizational problems. The defense attorneys tried to discredit my testimony, suggesting I was a vengeful widow seeking to blame others for my husband's natural death. But the recordings were undeniable, and the physical evidence corroborated every detail of the prosecution's case. The most powerful moment came when I testified about the victims, the elderly retirees, young families, and vulnerable people whose life savings had been stolen to fund the criminal operation. Margaret Chun testified about losing her husband because they couldn't afford his cancer treatment. David spoke about his father's heart attack caused by the stress of financial destruction. These defendants didn't just steal money, I told the jury during my final day of testimony. They stole hope, security, and in some cases they stole lives. My husband was murdered for threatening their operation, but he was just one victim in a pattern of violence and theft that destroyed dozens of families. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. The surgeon received 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Harrison was sentenced to life plus 50 years. Other organization members received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, effectively ensuring that none of them would ever threaten innocent people again. But the legal victory was only part of the justice we achieved. The investigation had recovered millions in stolen assets hidden in offshore accounts and legitimate businesses that had served as fronts for the criminal operation. A federal restitution fund was established to compensate victims, and while no amount of money could undo the damage that had been done, it provided some measure of financial recovery for people who'd lost everything. The sentencing hearing was particularly satisfying. Judge Martinez, who had presided over the trial, delivered a scathing condemnation of the defendants' crimes before imposing sentences that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. You operated a criminal enterprise that showed complete disregard for human life and dignity, Judge Martinez told the surgeon during sentencing. You murdered innocent people, destroyed families, and spread fear and suffering wherever your organization operated. Society will be safer with you permanently removed from it. As I watched the defendants being led away in shackles, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back my husband or undo the trauma that so many people had endured. The criminal organization had been destroyed, but the damage they'd caused would affect victims for the rest of their lives. Still, there was something profoundly meaningful about seeing these criminals face consequences for their actions. For too long they'd operated with impunity, confident that their violence and threats would keep victims silent and law enforcement at bay. My testimony and the evidence I'd gathered had shattered that confidence and ensured that their reign of terror was permanently ended. The victim network that had supported me throughout this ordeal celebrated the verdicts as a victory not just for justice, but for the principle that ordinary people could fight back against organized crime and win. Margaret, David, Patricia, and the others had played crucial roles in building the case, and their courage in testifying had helped secure convictions that might otherwise have been impossible. As I left the courthouse after the final sentencing, I realized that this chapter of my life was ending. The people who'd killed my husband were in prison forever. The criminal organization was destroyed, and the threat that had hung over me for months was finally eliminated. But I also understood that justice was more than punishment. It was about ensuring that something good came from tragedy, that suffering had meaning, that victims could become survivors and eventually helpers for others facing similar challenges. The hardest part was over, but the healing was just beginning. The restitution check I received from the Federal Recovery Fund was for $847,000, money that had been traced back to my husband's theft and the criminal organization's assets. It represented a portion of the millions that had been stolen, but it also represented something more important. The possibility of making amends for crimes I hadn't known I was benefiting from. I could have kept the money, used it to rebuild my life and try to forget the nightmare I'd survived. The government had determined that I was an innocent victim, not a willing participant in my husband's crimes. Legally and morally, I had every right to keep whatever compensation I received, but every dollar felt tainted with other people's suffering. Every luxury it could purchase would remind me of the retirement savings stolen from elderly victims, the college funds taken from young families, the security and hope that had been destroyed to fund my comfortable lifestyle. So I made a decision that surprised even my attorneys. I would use the restitution money to directly compensate my husband's victims, going beyond what the federal fund could provide to ensure that everyone affected received meaningful financial recovery. Margaret Chun was my first visit. I arrived at her studio apartment with a check that would allow her to move back into her own home and retire with dignity. When I explained what I was doing, she initially refused to accept it. "This isn't your responsibility," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You were a victim too. You don't owe us anything." "I lived in a house purchased with your retirement money," I replied. "I drove a car bought with your savings. I may not have known where the money came from, but I benefited from your suffering. Let me try to make that right. The check I gave Margaret was enough to restore her financial security and pay for the medical care her late husband should have received. It couldn't bring him back or erase the stress and hardship she'd endured, but it could ensure that her remaining years would be spent in comfort rather than poverty. James, the young father whose daughter's college fund had been stolen, broke down when I presented him with a check that would fully restore his child's educational savings plus additional funds for the years of financial stress he'd endured. I worked 3 jobs for 2 years trying to replace what your husband stole, he told me through tears. I missed school plays, soccer games, bedtime stories, all trying to earn back money that was taken in a day. You're giving me back more than money, you're giving me back time with my family. Each visit was emotionally exhausting but spiritually necessary. Patricia, the nurse facing retirement with nothing, could now leave her profession with dignity and security. David could honor his parents' memory by using the restored funds to establish a scholarship in their names. Every victim I met with received enough money to restore their financial position and compensate them for the years of hardship they'd endured, but making financial amends was only part of what I felt obligated to do. I also established a foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud, providing resources, support, and advocacy for people who'd been betrayed by trusted advisors and financial professionals. The foundation offered practical assistance helping victims navigate complex legal systems, connecting them with attorneys who specialized in fraud cases, providing emergency financial aid for people whose stolen savings had left them unable to afford basic necessities. But it also offered emotional support, recognizing that financial fraud created trauma that went far beyond monetary loss. Working with the victim network that had supported me throughout my ordeal, I created support groups where fraud victims could share their experiences and help each other heal from the betrayal and violation they'd experienced. Many victims blamed themselves for being naive or trusting, and the groups helped them understand that sophisticated criminals deliberately exploited normal human trust and compassion. I also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better procedures for investigating financial fraud and supporting victims through the legal process. My experience had shown how victims could become powerful allies in prosecuting criminals, but only if they received proper support and protection throughout the investigation. The foundation funded research into financial fraud prevention, developed educational materials to help people recognize and avoid sophisticated scams, and lobbied for stronger laws protecting victims and punishing perpetrators. We worked to ensure that what had happened to my husband's victims would be less likely to happen to others in the future. Perhaps most importantly, the foundation created a network of former victims who were committed to helping current victims navigate their recovery. People who lost everything to financial criminals were uniquely qualified to understand the trauma and practical challenges that other victims faced. Margaret became one of our most effective advocates, using her experience to help other elderly victims understand their rights and options. James developed educational programs for parents about protecting children's college savings. Patricia created resources specifically for healthcare workers who were targeted by criminals because of their stable incomes and trusting natures. As I watched these victims transform their suffering into service to others, I realized that making amends wasn't just about returning stolen money. It was about ensuring that something positive and lasting emerged from tragedy. We couldn't undo the crimes that had been committed, but we could help prevent future crimes and support future victims. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave meaning to my suffering and purpose to my survival. I'd been saved from my husband's criminal associates not just to see them punished, but to use my experience to help others who faced similar challenges. Every victim we helped, every criminal we helped prosecute, every person we educated about fraud prevention represented a victory over the forces that had destroyed so many lives. We were taking tragedy and transforming it into hope, taking suffering and converting it into strength. It would never fully compensate for what had been lost, but it was a way of honoring the victims and ensuring that their pain had not been meaningless. The therapy journal I started keeping 6 months after the trial became a record of the slow, difficult process of learning to trust again, not just other people, but my own judgment, my own perceptions, my own ability to distinguish truth from deception. Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma therapist I began working with, explained that betrayal by a trusted partner created a unique type of psychological damage. When someone you love completely deceives you, she said during one of our early sessions, it doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your ability to trust your own instincts about people. The journal documented my daily struggles with paranoia, hypervigilance, and the constant second-guessing that came from discovering that 8 years of marriage had been built on lies. I wrote about sleepless nights spent analyzing every relationship for signs of deception, every friendship for potential ulterior motives. Trust is like a muscle, Dr. Kim told me. When it's been severely damaged, you have to rebuild it gradually, starting with small exercises and working up to bigger challenges. Those small exercises began with learning to trust myself again. I had to acknowledge that the signs of my husband's criminal activities had been there, the secretiveness about finances, the unexplained income, the growing distance in our relationship, but that I'd chosen to ignore them because I wanted to believe in our marriage. You weren't naive, Dr. Kim reminded me repeatedly. You were normal. Trust is the foundation of healthy relationships, and most people in loving marriages don't investigate their partners like criminal suspects. Your husband exploited normal, healthy trust. The journal tracked my progress in small increments. Learning to sleep without checking the locks multiple times. Accepting dinner invitations from friends without spending hours analyzing their motives. Allowing myself to develop new friendships without conducting background investigations on potential friends. One of the most difficult aspects of rebuilding trust was dealing with my relationships with people who'd known my husband. Friends who'd socialized with us, colleagues who'd worked with him, family members who'd believed in his success. All of them had to process their own sense of betrayal and deception. Some relationships didn't survive. People who'd envied our lifestyle or borrowed money from us during our prosperous years struggled to reconcile their memories of my generous, successful husband with the reality of his criminal activities. A few accused me of having known about his crimes and covering for him, unable to accept that I'd been as deceived as everyone else. But other relationships grew stronger through the shared experience of processing betrayal and loss. My sister became my closest confidant, helping me work through the complex emotions of grieving a husband who'd been planning to abandon or kill me. My parents, initially shocked and confused by the revelations, eventually became fierce advocates for my healing and recovery. New relationships were particularly challenging. The foundation work brought me into contact with many people who admired my courage and wanted to support my mission. But I found myself constantly questioning their motives. Were they genuinely committed to helping fraud victims, or were they seeking to exploit my notoriety for their own purposes? Dr. Kim helped me develop strategies for evaluating new relationships without becoming paralyzed by suspicion. Look for consistency between words and actions, she advised. Trust people gradually, based on evidence of their character over time. And remember that some people will disappoint you. That's normal and doesn't mean you should stop trusting everyone. The journal documented breakthrough moments when I realized I was healing. The first time I went on a date without conducting an online investigation of the person beforehand. The first business partnership I entered into based on trust rather than extensive legal protections. The first time I loaned money to a friend without requiring documentation and collateral. Each small act of trust was a victory over the fear and paranoia that had dominated my life after discovering my husband's betrayal. Every relationship that proved genuine helped rebuild my confidence in my ability to judge character and make sound decisions. About people, the healing process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, times when someone would lie to me about something minor and I'd spiral into panic about whether I was being deceived again. Times when financial discrepancies in the foundation's accounts would trigger flashbacks to discovering my husband's hidden ledgers, but the journal also recorded growing strength and wisdom. I learned to trust while protecting myself, to be open to new relationships while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I developed better skills for recognizing red flags and addressing concerns directly rather than ignoring them. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own healing process. The trauma of betrayal would always be part of my history, but it didn't have to define my future. I could acknowledge the damage that had been done while still choosing to believe in the possibility of honest, healthy relationships. Working with other fraud victims through the foundation helped reinforce these lessons. Many of them struggled with similar trust issues, and supporting their healing helped me understand my own recovery process better. We shared strategies for rebuilding confidence, celebrating small victories, and supporting each other through setbacks. The therapy journal became more than just a record of healing. It became a tool for helping others understand that recovery from betrayal was possible. Dr. Kim encouraged me to share excerpts with other victims, showing them that the paranoia and fear they were experiencing were normal responses to trauma, not permanent personality changes. As I read through earlier entries, I could see clear progress from the frightened, suspicious person I'd been immediately after the trial to someone who was cautiously but genuinely open to new experiences and relationships. The healing wasn't complete. I suspected it might be a lifelong process, but it was real and substantial. Learning to trust again hadn't meant becoming naive or careless. Instead, it meant developing the wisdom to trust appropriately, to protect myself without isolating myself, to remain open to love and friendship while maintaining the boundaries necessary for emotional safety. The new driver's license arrived on a Tuesday morning, and seeing my photo next to my reclaimed maiden name felt like a symbolic rebirth. After 2 years of legal proceedings, therapy, and rebuilding my life from the ground up, I was finally ready to move forward as myself rather than as the widow of a criminal. Changing my name back had been one of many small but significant steps toward establishing a new identity separate from my husband's crimes and the trauma they'd created. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I'd chosen to do in response to those challenges. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a way to help my husband's victims had evolved into a national organization that assisted fraud victims, educated the public about financial crimes, and advocated for stronger protection laws. We'd helped over 300 victims recover assets, prosecute criminals, and rebuild their financial security. Margaret Chun had become the foundation's victim advocate coordinator, using her experience and natural empathy to guide newly victimized people through the complex process of recovery. Her work was so effective that other organizations began requesting her consultation on developing victim services programs. The foundation's educational initiatives had reached thousands of people through workshops, online resources, and partnerships with banks, investment firms, and professional associations. We'd created training programs for financial advisors about recognizing and reporting potential fraud, developed materials for seniors about protecting retirement savings, and established early warning systems that had prevented numerous crimes. But, perhaps most importantly, we'd created a community of survivors who understood that healing was possible and that tragedy could be transformed into purpose. The monthly support groups had evolved into regional networks where former victims mentored current ones, sharing practical advice and emotional support that professional counselors couldn't provide. My personal life had stabilized in ways I'd never expected. The panic attacks that had plagued me for months after the trial had gradually decreased as I learned to process trauma without being overwhelmed by it. Sleep came more easily, and when nightmares occurred, I had healthy coping strategies that helped me recover quickly. I'd even begun dating again. Though carefully and with the wisdom that came from hard experience, Dr. Kim had helped me understand that avoiding all romantic relationships wasn't healing. It was allowing my husband's betrayal to continue controlling my life. Learning to love again, with appropriate caution and clear boundaries, was the ultimate victory over the fear he'd created. The man I was seeing now was a detective who'd worked on financial fraud cases and understood the unique challenges faced by victims of sophisticated criminals. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honesty, transparency, and mutual respect for the healing we both had to do. After difficult experiences, standing in my new apartment smaller than the house I'd shared with my husband but purchased with money I'd earned through honest work, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The luxury furnishings and expensive art were gone, replaced by simple pieces that reflected my actual preferences rather than stolen wealth. The work With the foundation had become more than a career, it was a calling that gave meaning to suffering and purpose to survival. Every victim we helped, every criminal we assisted in prosecuting, every person we educated about fraud prevention represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy my life. I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving. It was about integrating traumatic experiences into a larger narrative of growth, strength, and service to others. The betrayal and danger I'd survived had become sources of wisdom and empathy that enabled me to help people facing similar challenges. The financial security I'd rebuilt was modest compared to the wealth I'd unknowingly enjoyed during my marriage. But it was earned through work that aligned with my values and contributed to something larger than personal comfort. Every dollar represented honest effort and meaningful purpose. Looking toward the future, I saw possibilities rather than threats. The foundation would continue growing, helping more victims and preventing more crimes. My relationship would develop at its own pace, built on trust that was informed by experience rather than blind faith. My healing would continue, supported by therapy, community, and the satisfaction of work that mattered. The woman who discovered her husband's crimes in a supply closet had been naive, trusting, and unprepared for the realities of betrayal and danger. The woman I become was wiser, stronger, and committed to ensuring that others wouldn't face similar challenges alone. I would always carry the scars of what I survived. But those scars had become sources of strength rather than shame. They reminded me of my resilience, my capacity for growth, and my ability to transform suffering into service. As I prepared for another day of foundation work, meeting with new victims and continuing the fight against financial crime, I realized that my husband's attempt to destroy my life had ultimately led to its greatest purpose. His crimes had created my calling, his betrayal had revealed my strength, and his death had given birth to a mission that would outlast both of us. The nightmare was over, but the meaningful work it had inspired was just beginning. I was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond my control. I was an active participant in creating justice, healing, and hope for others who needed to know that survival was possible and that tomorrow could be better than today if you followed this journey and found inspiration in the possibility of transforming tragedy into purpose. Like and subscribe to support others who are fighting their own battles against deception, betrayal, and those who profit from other people's pain. Your story matters, your healing is possible, and your strength is greater than you know.